I'm Jim Collison and live from the Gallup campus here in Omaha, Nebraska. This is Gallup's Call to Coach, recorded on July 8th, 2016. Call to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you do have questions during the webcast, we do, and especially today, we'll entertain your questions live. Best way to do that is to join our chat room. It's right below the main video window down there. So if you look down, there's a chat room. Log into it. Bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a button that says Log In. Just select that, select the guest account, put your name in, and hit Submit, and you will join us in the chat room, and we will be taking live questions. So the best way to do that is to get in the chat room and do it. Don't forget to visit the Gallup Strengths Center. That's just GallupStrengthsCenter.com for all your coaching resources and StrengthsFinder training needs. You can also catch the video and both streaming and downloadable audio for all the webcasts that we do here at Gallup, including the links to our mobile apps where you can get your top 5 right there on your phone. It's available on our coaches blog. That's just coaching.gallup.com. If you are listening to the recorded version and you have questions about custom strengths coaching solutions for small, medium, or large organizations, feel free to contact us via email at that's just coaching@gallup.com, or use the contact form right there on the live page. Jade Wood is our guest today. Jade is Gallup's well-being subject matter expert and leads Gallup's well-being consulting. Jade is also located in our Washington, D.C. office. Jade, welcome to Call to Coach. Great to have you.
Thank you so much, Jim. Great to be here.
Well, let's dig in a little bit. That your bio is listed in both the event that we're doing here, but we want to get to know you a little bit. So let's back us up a little bit. Maybe where you're from and education that brings you to this point.
Absolutely. Thank you. I am from California. I lived there for a fair amount of my life, both in Southern and Northern, and I am a licensed psychotherapist. I received most of my clinical training in San Francisco, working in a tertiary hospital and then also in an outpatient clinic, and ended up then pursuing healthcare administration, healthcare delivery and operations and so forth, and am fortunate now to be here with Gallup and be able to work really at the intersection of the two, helping organizations create cultures of well-being, private sector, government, healthcare, education, and so forth, and think about employee welfare, how that impacts their employees, the organization, clients, and customers, and so forth. And then in addition, I still maintain a private practice, and so I see patients for psychotherapy.
And so for us as a subject matter expert on well-being, that's a big, broad topic when we just think about well-being. You mentioned we're helping customers, and can you give us just a kind of some basic examples of some things we might do with customers, or what you might do to kind of move the needle when we think about well-being?
Sure. What we really do is we help organizations think about how they position their policies and their mission and their brand and their role of the managers and leaders to be an environment that is a conduit for greater well-being for the employee. So unfortunately, many employed Americans actually see their job as a detriment to their overall well-being, and we're really working to turn that around, seeing an organic opportunity to improve employee welfare, to improve individuals' lives, and thinking about the intentional action and strategy that organizations can take where their employee well-being strategy is fitting into everything that they're also doing with their business and their services and so forth as part of one overall cultural initiative.
Oh, very cool. We want to dig in today on the idea of therapy, and this was something we've been talking about internally, and it shows up in our Facebook group from time to time of this idea of what is coaching and what is therapy or what is counseling. I'll throw those 3 words out there, and so Jade, maybe you can take a few minutes as we think about what are the differences when we think about coaching versus therapy. What are those differences? Can you kind of help us understand that?
Absolutely. I think that we can first maybe just think about what unites the two or what's similar. And there's certainly a great overlap and a shared mission around improving individuals' quality of life, improving functioning, increasing people's self-awareness, and overall, I think we could say that there's kind of an authentic self-mission either with psychotherapy counseling as well as with, of course, coaching. But I think the way that the coach or the therapist uses themselves and the way that the patient or the clients use the coach or the therapist, that's where I think a significant difference certainly sets in. So while there are many ways to practice therapy, oftentimes the psychotherapy patient or client will use, and I'm referring to use in a very positive way, that we want our clients, our patients to use us. They will use the therapist to sort of heal old wounds or to heal trauma. So as a therapist, oftentimes our role is really shifting throughout the course of treatment, and we end up becoming many different things for the patient or the client throughout the course of the therapy as they relive and work through different things that have happened to them or different beliefs that they have. Sometimes we refer to this as sort of being the good object or the bad object, the good mother, and so forth. So that way in which the therapist shows up and some of those boundaries as opposed to the coach certainly play a role in the differentiation of the content that comes forward and the way that we show up.
Lots of training goes into that. When we think about the difference between being a therapist and being a coach, what if one is a coach and they're seeing or they're feeling like this may be slipping, or what are some telltale signs to think, oh, this may be well beyond the coaching realm, when I'm here? What kind of things would I look for as a coach? And what, I think most importantly, why should I be careful in this? I mean, why does it matter?
Sure. Well, I think it's critical that everyone knows their limits. Coaches, psychotherapists, sort of humans, all of us, right? And so all of the roles are critical, coaching and therapy, and there's a line between the two, and we really cannot be both. So anytime a therapist also tries to coach, anytime a coach also tries to be a therapist, what we're really doing is bailing out on our client and abandoning them in both roles because we're not really going to be able to be successful in that endeavor. So, the way that I think about this sometimes is that how do we think about our boundaries and the container within our coaching session or within our therapy patients, just thinking that boundaries are not, they're not separations, but they're meeting points. And as a coach, a few ways to tell that maybe it's time to think about, in addition to coaching therapy for a client, I think overall I would say, first of all, as a coach, really trust yourself, trust what you're seeing, trust what you're feeling, and so forth. And then I would say some other flags or some other indicators might be if you're seeing any pattern of addiction show up in any way, whether someone's thinking about how they're using food or alcohol or gambling or anything along those lines. If you're noticing a lot of certain emotions, and this is not to pathologize any emotions in any way, but if you're seeing, a lot of sadness or a lot of anger, that's a sign that there's probably something there that's pretty, deeply rooted and needs some work to be done. On the contrast, if you're seeing a flatness, someone might be exhibiting signs of depression. Also, I think as a coach, coaches sort of tend to really get their hands in their clients' lives and so forth. And if you catch yourself noticing repetition, certain situations or dynamics, things that keep happening to the client that they can't seem to avoid, and they sort of don't really understand why they found themselves in this situation again. As humans, we will reenact things and recreate things in our lives until we've healed them, had more awareness around them, overcome them. And so that's also an opportunity to refer to therapy for, just a different type of working with what's coming up.
Yeah. How hard do you think, though, is that conversation as a coach, and you may dig some of these, in the coaching aspect, some of these things might come up. Any advice? Because saying, wow, I really think you need therapy is that's not the easiest thing to say. So you live kind of in both worlds. What are some tips or tricks, or I hate to even say it that way because we're talking about people's lives, but what's the right thing? What's the right thing to say in those situations?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's. Of course, it certainly depends on the rapport, on the timing, on what's happening in the coaching relationship, and so forth. All of those contextual factors, but I think that instead of approaching an individual, Jim, in the example that you just mentioned, which I think in a way is a very direct sort of opposing, you need therapy, there's a way in which you can kind of join with your client, almost if you were sort of physically coming up next to them, and just sort of say something along the lines of, I think as with empathy and with as much normalization as possible, because frankly we can all benefit from therapy quite often in our lives. But saying something like, I've really noticed that you're quite sad very often, and I'm seeing a lot of emotion, and sometimes I'm just wondering if some even further work, maybe talking to someone else might serve you and might help increase your quality of life or might help you achieve these goals. Mentioning it in a way that's not threatening, and in a way that's not a big deal, because it really isn't a big deal.
Yeah, and when we use the word counseling in this context as well, and I don't know the lines there, so does that cover it? Is it a part of it, a segment of it? How do you in this world, how do we see that term counseling fitting into this paradigm?
That's right. As a mental health professional, as mental health professionals, we identify as psychologists or psychotherapists, as counselors, and that's based on licensure and legality and so forth, also an identification around how we practice. I would say that when coaches are working with their clients and they're thinking about bringing therapy or counseling into the conversation, the words are interchangeable, and whatever feels like a better fit or more comfortable, I think either one is fine.
And so from the standpoint of referring someone on, or say I'm a coach, I'm a StrengthsFinder coach now, and I need to refer someone on. Are there networks available to me, or what's the best way to go about getting a referral for someone to move into therapy or counseling if that's identified in a coaching session?
Sure. I mean, of course, the ideal situation is that the coach has a therapist, that they know in some capacity as part of their community, or that someone they trust knows, and there can be a referral branch from there. But that is certainly not always the case for many reasons. Psychology Today and Good Therapy are both online mental health professional directories that are quite well respected. They verify the credentials and the license and the background and so forth, and then it gives the therapists who list their practices on those sites an opportunity to describe a bit about how they practice and what they specialize in and so forth. So you can, of course, search by treatment, maybe by an issue that you're looking for, but also certainly by geography and so forth.
So good practice as a coach, if you're not a licensed therapist or counselor, to have a network maybe to refer to. Would that be a common thing for folks to have available to them?
I mean, I would imagine that as a coach, you might want to have sort of some allied health professionals that you are working with, both for referrals and resources and bouncing things off of, and kind of thinking about the full dimension of healing and working with your clients and so forth. But I think each practice is, each individual's coaching practice is unique, and I think whatever tools you best think are in your tool belt is the way to go.
Yeah. So I'm a strengths coach today, let's just say I am, and I'm thinking about, I want to take this a little bit deeper and maybe do more counseling or more therapy. What's the education track, or how do I need to start? Where would I go to start going down that path?
Sure. So then you would want to think about your educational options as well as the license that you would ultimately like to receive. Irrespective of what that path looks like, there's a certain structure that would include a type of graduate school, a certain number of hours in a residency or an internship, practicum, etc., and then state licensing exams. And then so the output of that is a PhD, a licensed social worker, a licensed there's so many, a licensed counselor, a marriage and family therapist, and in certain ways, many of them are just, there's so many ways up a mountain, right? So there's a lot of overlap, I guess. So you ultimately want to do your due diligence, talk with practitioners in the field, kind of find out what are those differences and what feels right, and then certainly look at graduate programs. But the graduate program and so forth would be the requirement to be, a licensed counselor, psychotherapist, psychologist, and in any regard.
And you may not know this answer. Is that different state by state? Is there a federal governing board when we think about licensing? How does that work?
So the licensure requirements differ state by state, but the fact of licensure and that graduate school internship hours exam trajectory is in place in every single state.
Okay. When we think about coaches needing coaches, and I think this is one of the areas Micah and I had talked about this of really having you kind of dig in a little bit. As coaches, and we may see some things, or we may need some either some self-help or some self-well-being when we just think about what are
Right.
some things we can do. So
Right.
as a coach, can you talk a little bit about that as a coach and these kind of things? What are some things we can do to kind of take care of ourselves in this environment?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, whether you're a therapist or a coach, I would say there's a really good chance that you have an affinity for taking care of others. And sometimes that ends up even being a bit of overfunctioning for individuals in our lives. And that can result in a lack of self-care, never always putting ourselves last and so forth. And so I think this comes back to the conversation around boundaries and a willingness to take care of oneself, which I think sometimes can be a discipline if our default is to put all of our energy in the other or the others in our lives. But ultimately, it's likely that you will be your best coach when you're at your best self. And so this usually means, the things that we most of us probably hear about quite often around sleep and nutrition, exercise, social relationships, connectivity. In fact, many of the ways that Gallup defines well-being. And I will also just add to that this is all coaching and therapy. It's all such deep work. And so I really think it's really important to acknowledge that as coaches, you are getting into people's psyches. And as much as you really want to be able to get in and do some work with them, you really want to make sure that you're able to get out, right? So you really want to make sure that you're not taking things home with you, that you're not sort of carrying around, your coachee's sort of stuff that's somehow stuck to you, and that you kind of know how to discharge and really are able to have the time and the space around self-care to be aware of how your clients are impacting you, and that you really kind of protect yourself.
Yeah, SP in the chat room, SP Parker in our chat room, says that they see some therapy in the sense or counseling because they deal with patients that have trauma. So sometimes we think of that as a coach, like this trauma happened to me, and so I need
Right.
it. But oftentimes, and I think you were alluding to this, we may be dealing with those who we are coaching who have deep emotional trauma or deep physical trauma from that standpoint. We see a lot of this with folks coming out of the military where that may be a physical trauma. And so you mentioned it of taking on, sometimes you go in deep and you take that on, right? So that's a safe place, right? I mean, to come back and be able to discuss that with someone else, good practice, best practice.
I think that's a great practice, whether it's with with your therapist, through professional consultation, through a consultation group, and then as well as an own daily practice that you have, and especially when we're working with people who have trauma, there's vicarious trauma. We can end up experiencing that trauma ourselves to some extent, to taking it in, and certainly if we have our own, unhealed things in our lives, which is so easy to have, then that's going to get stirred up by working with other people who have trauma, which is not to say that that's contraindicated, but it just means that you have to have then that special attention and awareness of what's happening within yourself, so that you that you don't sort of run yourself down, right, and sort of don't underestimate the gravity of the work that we're all doing.
Yeah. A couple things out of the chat room, just to kind of stay in real time with them. SP had mentioned that, I think I'm going to say SP, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but had to certify by category and 8 years of oversight before acquiring an independent advocate level, state certification plus education. I should also mention we're talking about U.S. certifications, and this is a global webcast, and so certifications, I always have to remember, certifications will differ based on your country origin as well. Judy asked this question. She said, to get back to coaching versus therapy, if we don't suspect folks have an overriding need for therapy, but the relationship is veering more towards therapy than coaching, how do we draw it back to a coaching conversation? Any thoughts on that?
I almost always would default to transparency and to authenticity. So I think as long as you feel comfortable and like it would be safe for you and safe for the client, I would maybe inquire in some way about the direction that the relationship is shifting and kind of find out about their experience of it and what they're noticing, what's happening. Certainly if it is veering into a therapeutic place, then that likely means that the client is making themselves more vulnerable and is probably even more attached to you. So it's just important to be mindful of the ways in which, you may not, it may be difficult to predict what might come up for them. So certainly caution, but ultimately, if you in any way feel that the relationship is, not within kind of the contract of what you're trained for or where you really want to be, then I think it's important to listen to that, because otherwise it won't be safe for you or for the client to continue down that path.
Yeah, and I think that what you mentioned, transparency, is very, very key in that. And I think that also plays into the fact SP says that in some of the discussions, she views therapy as a very normal part of the process, not being like, oh, you need therapy. Is different than, let's consider this. Oftentimes this can be a part of the healing process or a part of the maintenance process, right? If we think we're working in an environment that has a lot of stress, a lot of trauma, those kinds of things. What are some early warning signs in ourselves as we kind of get back to the me as a coach and working and things I'm seeing in me? Are they the same signs we see in people, or what would I look for, like all of a sudden and think like, ooh, my well-being may be out of balance? There may be some things I want to think about.
Sure. So in therapy, we often use the language of transference and countertransference. And so in a way, we just discussed transference, when clients project or put their stuff kind of on you, their issues or their kind of unfelt feelings or so forth. But then there's countertransference, and that is almost the opposite. And so that is when our stuff, and I'll explain more about that, sort of comes up from working with clients. So it's the way that we are able to become aware of our own personal work. So an example might be if a coach is working with a client that is maybe dealing with issues of being too passive in the workplace, and the client needs to stand up for themselves or have more volition in the workplace. And as you're working with that client, if you as the coach notice that you're getting abnormally activated, as we call in psychotherapy, this is like called being triggered, right? So if you're sort of charged by what's happening, maybe there's a strong desire to tell them what to do, maybe you're having undue anger, maybe there's a strong desire to just kind of bulldoze or push this problem that they're having away, that's kind of an example of you're not as clear, and this is sort of your stuff. It's your own reaction, and it's almost like the psyche's friendly notice or friendly way of saying, hey, you have a little bit of work to do around this. This is bringing up something for you that's from your own personal life, from your history, and so forth. And we all have this. I mean, we all have this regularly, daily, and I think ultimately what actually separates us in terms of a quality of life and so forth is those of us who kind of are willing to work more with what comes up for us in a number of ways and so forth.
We often think of therapy or counseling in terms of the physical or of the emotional state, where we're at emotionally and some of those pieces. When we think about the well-being concept overall, are there physical elements that sometimes lead to the emotional? In other words, are there things I could be doing to myself? I think sometimes sleep, right? When we think of getting enough rest or getting enough exercise, are there some of those early warning signs that can be seen physically first, but they then manifest themselves later in an emotional experience? Can that be an early warning, when we think about total well-being?
Sure. I mean, I think that we all probably have gateways or sort of ways to know that, oh, I'm heading into, I'm slipping into sort of my least best self or something, or I'm sort of now on a path where I know this is not going to be well from a self-care perspective. And so whether that is you're sleeping less or more than you normally do, or you have an appetite change, your relationship with food changes, perhaps alcohol is playing a different role in your life, perhaps there's that tension migraine that you always get, or there's frequent, accidents because you're not paying attention. Like, I think that there's ways in which, as long as you're able to know yourself and kind of know what your, warnings are, but oftentimes, the mind and the way that it can actually brilliant, but the way that it can kind of maneuver things can, if there's an emotion that maybe we don't want to feel, it can express itself physically sometimes and sort of bypass the entire psychological process. So I see the mind and the body as quite connected and continually informing one another.
Yeah, and SP mentions, she says, I have difficulty being objective when I'm ill. I often have to be careful and acknowledge that I'm not at my best self and have to bring boundaries in. Can you talk a little bit with illness? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can absolutely. I was actually thinking just the other day about for an experience I was having that so simple, but so a former clinical instructor had said once, whenever we're angry, hungry, sad, or tired, there's going to be a different filter that's in place, and the ways in which we react, our ability to respond, what we kind of are bringing to any situation or dynamic is going to be different. And so how can we, you know, be willing to kind of see those limitations that we have at times out of our humanness, and then, exactly as you said, sort of set some of those boundaries so that you don't set yourself up to act in a way or behave in a way that you would not want to for your client's sake or for your sake and so forth. And I think that, it's often difficult for all of us. I mean, I know for myself to kind of accept these parts of ourselves that are human and that are not always as great and can't always really show up. And that's part of, I think, also just doing your own work as a coach, because that's also the great thing, is really it's like anything you're experiencing, if you can have some insight into it a few days or weeks later, it adds more to your breadth of knowledge and understanding of human interaction and human functioning that you can bring to your clients, and then you can really relate to them on an empathic level, because any of the messiness that you may be experiencing in your life, which is not to say that sickness is totally equitable to messiness, but just anything that you're experiencing, is certainly happening to them, in one degree or another.
Yeah, we've mentioned the word transparency several times. Can a coach be too transparent in a setting or a situation where there may be can we bring some of our own needs to a coaching conversation that really is about our client, but we end up addressing things about ourselves? Is that too much transparency, and can that happen?
I mean, I think I would have to really hear like situation by situation. I know for psychotherapy that is, and again, there's many ways to practice psychotherapy, but and the way that therapists use themselves in the room and kind of bring in their own life experience is tailored and hopefully usually a conscious decision, but overall it doesn't happen. It's certainly, the exception. I do think with coaches that there is a little bit more of a, you as yourself in that relationship. But Jim, the way that you were explaining, I think that it does sound in that kind of scenario that you described that the coach is probably, unduly using that session and showing up almost too much in a way that's probably eclipsing the client.
And can that be an early warning sign that as a coach, like when I'm doing most of the talking in a session and the person
That's
isn't,
right. Yeah.
could that be an early warning sign?
That sounds like that would be a really good warning sign. Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting. When we first started doing Call to Coach, one of the folks here timed how often we spoke and how often the guest spoke while we were doing this. And we got a report back like, okay, it was Jeremy Petrosini at the time. Jeremy, you spoke 23 minutes. The guest spoke 17. I'm just making that up, but
sure.
That's almost an indicator, right? I mean, if you're new to coaching, you're starting to work in it. We're recording the session not to prove anything on the backside, but to self-evaluate, like, how much am I talking and how much is who I'm coaching talking, and maybe even physically timing that at some point to get some indication of, am I doing the majority of it or whatever? I'm just trying to give folks a helpful hand. I know I'm bad about this. I like to talk a lot. I have communication number 4, and it's just easier for me to talk than to listen. But I'll also bring some of my own things into it. So interesting. JB asked this question there. He says, how do we share resources both personally and with friends, but also with clients to help them get over the stigma that's maybe associated with a mental illness? We haven't talked about that part yet, but therapy and mental illness and maybe the stigma of that. Can you talk a little bit about that question?
Yeah, I mean the mental health stigma around any sort of identifiable mental health issues or just mental health sort of complications in general, unfortunately, is very alive and very real. And individuals either that are family members or experiencing something themselves can often experience a great deal of shame and that stigma itself. So on those two websites that I had mentioned, on Psychology Today and on Good Therapy, there is a host of resources around kind of having conversations like this, or articles about how do we reduce that stigma that you can kind of give to people to reflect on, and as part of self-education. And I just think I think that's an excellent opportunity for coaching or for psychotherapy to work with the shame that comes up and sort of what is it that's arising around this stigma, this sort of inner voice that you have that maybe is not quite as useful or serving you. Where does that come from? And then also, of course, certainly thinking about the roles in society and the way that we are in a way socialized against mental health. And where are the safe places for the people that are suffering?
Yeah. No, it's good. It's a tough area. That's why I think we need to leave it to the pros from that standpoint,
Sure.
and you're being one of those. When we think about disorders, or when we think about mental illness, and I see this sometimes in our groups, in our Facebook group or on Yammer, not so much there, but mostly in our Facebook group, and people trying to tie strengths to these disorders in some way, or trying to make that link. When we think about strengths and we think about the therapy side, should we be trying to make connections, or how do we handle that as coaches in fairness?
I mean, Jim, I think if I understand you, and of course, please correct me if I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, I don't think that it's serving, anyone, including the mission of strengths, to try to create some sort of direct linkage, if this is what I'm understanding, between strengths and a proclivity to show up in different mental illnesses. And I think that when we think about anything that's occurring within a human, we have to think about the genetic and societal and cultural and family of origin and generational dynamics and there's so many things that make up who we are in each moment, and that's continually shifting and evolving as well. So I think that I just think that's too simplistic and potentially a bit rigid, not to mention harmful, even if it's well-intentioned, and I hope that I'm not overreacting to that in any way. But I do think that the best use of strengths, like anything else, for anyone suffering from anything, is to think about how their strengths can help them heal and have quality of life and know themselves more and trust themselves more and frankly love themselves more, irrespective of what's happening in their life or what they're going through.
Yeah, and so let me give, I think, an easy example to just shed this out. So ADD, of course, is one of those, or ADHD is a very common. People claim it, they don't even have it, right? It's become a kind of a socially acceptable when I don't have any, when I can't sit still for a few minutes. We say those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And then, but then I see sometimes if say I'm diagnosed and I struggle with that, and I look at my top 5. As a coach, can we have this conversation of what themes or group of themes could I use to help me overcome, or to help me, whatever we want to achieve in that? Should we be trying to do that? For some of these diagnosed symptoms, should we be trying to fix them or address them directly with StrengthsFinder?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a difference between sort of, I'm going to address your illness with a strength, versus I'm going to help you utilize your strengths as you cope with what's occurring in your life on a daily basis that may be rooted in this ADHD that you have. So I think it's a little bit more around coping and increasing quality of life, as I think, as I probably mentioned. But, and again, I'm sorry if I might not be completely answering this on the same page with you, but I think that when we're sort of doing a direct, like, strengths as an antidote or something, I would love for that to be something that showed, effectiveness. But I think it's more around sort of what's the goal that your client has? I mean, a client with ADHD probably does not come to a strengths coach or a coach and is like, I need you to help me get rid of my ADHD, right? So they're probably like, I noticed that my ADHD really comes up, or I have it's a stronger reaction during this meeting or on this day, and then you might incorporate strengths as, again, thinking about how that individual is responding and some behaviors or actions that they can take, but I don't know if strengths is necessarily leading the charge against the ADHD or how the ADHD is showing up.
Okay, so I hear you saying kind of using it more as a toolbox to address, how can we strategize around moving forward or minimizing the effects that it has in certain situations. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think using strengths as a way to enable the individual to understand themselves more, to understand what's driving their behavior, to understand how they see and perceive the world, and then as they have greater awareness there, then I would imagine that that would help them to cope and to live with anything in their life better, including ADHD or something along those lines.
Yeah. And of course, not picking on that, just using that as an example, I think it's an easy one because at least in the American culture, that's an easy, we talk about it all the time, it's out there. I don't think anyone is ashamed by it from that standpoint. It's gotten a lot of press. But how many, when we think about helping people along these lines, and this is going to be a bad question, but
No bad question.
Well, one of these things, I think sometimes we're too quick to try to prescribe, even using our themes, even using what we're best at. In a typical situation, someone who's working through a major problem, from a duration standpoint, is that measured in weeks or months or years? And I know it depends on the patient and some of those kinds of things, but I want to kind of think, you almost err on the side of it taking longer than it taking shorter, right? People don't typically, we typically try to go too fast or not when trying to work with these situations.
I mean, there are certain things that are just going to be with us for life that we are going to have to live with and experience and have some good coping days and some ugly coping days with. And then there are certain things that you can see a marked difference in your ability to heal and to, live fully and enjoy life 6 months, 1 year, 2 years out. So it certainly depends, but with strengths, with psychotherapy, with coaching, there is, there's rarely, I think, a quick fix if you really have the desire to get to the root of what's happening and not just sort of put a Band-Aid on something, but really, in a sense, kind of change who you are, change how you see the world, and change the course that your life was going to go.
Jade, as we kind of bring this in for a landing, these always go super fast when we're done. Right. But any question I didn't ask when we think about dealing with, coaching versus therapy, or working with clients that may need therapy, or even self-help, when we think about anything I didn't ask or a question I didn't cover that is really important that I might have missed?
I don't know if this is really important, but one thing that I thought about when we were thinking about that relationship or the spectrum between coaching and therapy, and I know that many strengths coaches use the balcony basement analogy. And I often think of the basement of one of the themes as almost the sort of the symptom. It's almost like the gateway to therapy, right? So I think that if you see someone and they are in the basement, then that's a sign. If they're achievers, often in the basement, if et cetera, that's almost a sign that there are some deeper roots, and that's an opportunity to go to psychotherapy. Because I think that when you see any of the 34 from a basement perspective, oftentimes they're not serving the client, and oftentimes they're actually probably coming from just a deeper place of beliefs or of self-esteem or something that's oftentimes getting in the way. And it certainly depends. I mean, I think I can certainly speak for myself. My top 5 once in a while are totally in the basement, but I think it's different between sort of did it just go down to the basement to grab something really quickly, or is there like a bed in the basement? Like, is this strength living in the basement, right? And I think that's a good way to think about sort of coaching versus psychotherapy, and the way in which they all live sort of, again, along the spectrum.
Yeah, and since you mentioned top 5, I should have asked that up front. What are your top 5? So folks know. Everybody's going to ask me. So what are your top 5?
Oh, sure. So achiever is my number 1, hence the achiever example. Input is second, then woo, strategic, and maximizer.
Oh, okay, good. JB asks, is there a difference in how one evaluates working with a coach or a therapist? Just wondering if there's something there. So is there a difference in how one evaluates working with either a coach or a therapist?
I mean, I think there would be a yes and a no to that. So the yes would, or the no would be, I'm sure there's similar criteria of, effectiveness, outcomes, rapport, a sense of care, that connection and availability and so forth. But at the same time, I would imagine that, and certainly not always the case, but kind of your informed consumer would anticipate different outcomes from seeing a coach than they would from seeing a therapist. And so in that sense, the metric would be different.
Okay. Good. Well, I think Jim Supple says that description of the bed in the basement was really helpful. So he appreciates that. That is a good. I love the often around the strengths language, we create these visualizations, which are very, very helpful, and so always appreciate. Well, Jade, we appreciate you coming on and being a part of this. I know this is a really, 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 I think, a very sticky situation for some people when we think about the two. And this is kind of a first for Called to Coach. We usually stick to kind of the strengths and the business of coaching and top 5 and where you've had success and taking teams and team grids and all that other stuff that we talk about all the time. And so I appreciate you taking some time today to be a part of this. From a Gallup standpoint, if folks really wanted to follow what we're doing in the area you're working as an SME for well-being, what's really the best way for them to kind of follow that, or if they wanted to participate in some way or get their organization tied in to what you talked about in the very beginning of the program, what's the best way for them to contact us?
That's right, certainly. Well, individuals can always reach out to me directly. So my email is my first and last name. So that's Jade, Jade _Wood at Gallup.com. And then additionally, for more content related and to stay updated on well-being tracking in the U.S. and around the globe, at Gallup.com, you'll see there at the top, topics, and well-being is one of those, and 2 drop-down menus in terms of consultative offerings as well as subjects, and we're updating that daily. We interview with our partner about 500 Americans every single night in the U.S. on their well-being, so we're tracking well-being at community, state, national levels, and that's constantly, of course, a wealth of data that we're combing through and releasing those findings.
Good. Yeah, I always tell the coaches, let Gallup.com be your friend. And actually, if you just go to Gallup.com right now, just pause the video, go to Gallup.com right now, and search for Jade. She has published articles out there as well that are talking about, and you can read up on some of this. Jade SP is one final note, says, I'd like to see more of this type of webcast. I believe it can bring clarity to roles and identifying them being totally messed up the end there, Jade. I'd like to see more of this type of webcast. I believe it can bring clarity to roles, period, and identifying being in them or out of them. In other words, is this the role of a coach or is this the role of a therapist, is what she's saying. And I do too. Jade, maybe you can help us with that as we progress forward with this. If you see areas for us to bring in this kind of content and what we're doing from a well-being perspective, especially as we think about people, just let me know, and we'll have you back or have somebody on to talk about that.
Sure, absolutely. I would love that. I mean, we all, continuing education is how we, refine and improve our work. So that sounds wonderful.
Yeah. So we'll help us focus. JB as well says he'd love to see some more well-being webcasts. So that might be a good opportunity. It's interesting because even on the side, here at Gallup, we practice when we think about those 5 elements of well-being, and we do a really good job here on the campus in Omaha covering those physical and financial and career and some of those as well, and have come up with some interesting ways to think about it. I would think as a coach, I would think having that well-being concept and arsenal at the ready when you're coaching, not just about what you're doing with your top 5, but how are you living your life in some kind of balance with these 5 elements. Don't you think that'd be a pretty smart way to coach?
I do, absolutely. And then I think it also provides such an opportunity for self-reflection of how do your top 5 show up in the different elements. And maybe it's, in the balcony for one, but totally in the basement for another. And so that intersection, I think, just has a lot of rich material, too.
Yeah, if you head out to shop.gallup.com and search for well-being, we wrote a whole book on it. And so we're referring to those 5 elements. Well done and well documented in the book, and a lot of data behind that as well. So,
that's right.
Jade, hang tight for me one sec. I'll wrap things up,
Sure.
And we'll remind everyone to take full advantage of all the resources we have available at the Gallup Strengths Center, just gallupstrengthscenter.com. You can send us your questions, comments if you'd like to be guest blogger on our coaches blog. We do have a lot of things going on in the coaches blog, and if you haven't checked that out, a lot of great articles that are doing very, very well. Just head out to coaching.gallup.com. If you want to be that guest blogger, send us an email, coaching@gallup.com, and put guest blogger in the subject line, and that will get that routed to the right place. By the way, at the coaches blog, the links to our Facebook group, YouTube page, our iTunes and RSS feeds, iPhone and Android apps, as well as the weekly Strengths Wisdom program that we have going on here in 2016. All available for you out there, coaching.gallup.com. If you're interested in becoming a Gallup Certified Strengths Coach, we get this question all the time. There's a list of courses that are available on our courses site, and you'll see a pattern to our email addresses. It's just courses.gallup.com. We try not to make it too difficult to remember, or you can send us an email, certification@gallup.com. Or there's a contact page. If you're on our live page right now, there's just a contact form right in the corner. Put that in there and a phone number where somebody can call you back, and they'll do that. We are within a week of the Clifton Strengths Summit here in Omaha, July 18th, 19th, and 20th, and it's just going to be a party you will not want to miss. It's not too late, and I think we'll even take walk-ins. So if you can get to Omaha on Monday, July 18th, we're just a week away. We'd love to see you. You can still get registered right now if you want to do it, but we're just a week away. We'd love to see you at the summit. If you found this helpful, we'd ask that you share it, and we thank everyone for joining us. And we will look forward to the next Call to Coach, and with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.